The book of Revelation has had a checkered history throughout church history, especially in our modern day. Two approaches that seem to characterize. Usually we become infatuated with the book, and the so-called attempt to read Revelation in one hand with the morning newspaper in the other, and drawing all kinds of connections. So what in our modern day seems to be fulfilling or seems to be reflected in the images and the language of Revelation. So infatuation with trying to figure out how Revelation is fulfilled in the modern day and all the modern day technologies and political situations, and charting how close we might be to the end because of that. The other approach, the opposite, is to simply ignore the book. Although John claims to not seal it up at the very end, for most Christians, Revelation is still a sealed book, and we would rather leave it in the hands of the experts and ignore it altogether. However, I think we do it an injustice if we do that. The book of Revelation was actually a book meant to be understood by the first readers. I find it interesting that when we think about other books of the Bible, we're interested in asking what would this have meant to the original readers, what did it mean in its original historical context, and we ignore that when it comes to the book of Revelation. But Revelation was a book that the readers of the first century and John, who wrote it, would have been very familiar with. Revelation resembles a common type of literature in the first century, though we don't have any real close parallels today, known as an apocalypse. It was a vision communicated in graphic symbols and images. And Revelation was meant not so much to describe reality literally, but to describe reality in symbols and images that the author communicates to us that reflect what he saw in his vision. The book of Revelation then was meant to be understood by its first century readers. In fact, Revelation, what we often miss, Revelation is also a letter. A letter communicated something the first readers could have understood, something that met their needs and their situation. John tells us in chapter 1 and verse 3 that there's a blessing for the one who hears the words of this prophecy and who put it into practice, or who keep it, or who obey it. How could the first century readers be expected to obey a book that they had no idea what it was about? Later on at the very end of the book, John is told not to seal up the words of the prophecy because the time is at hand. To seal up a book was to keep its contents hidden for a later time. But John is told just the opposite. Don't seal it up, because this is a message directly relevant to the readers. So what does it do? Basically, the book of Revelation is meant not to predict the future. We often think of Revelation as a book about end times, a book about eschatology, a book that we use to chart what the end times are going to look like. But Revelation is so much more than that. At the heart of it is a call to worship God and to worship the Lamb and follow Jesus Christ in obedience no matter what the cost. Revelation is far more than just end times. It contains much about worship. It contains much about discipleship, what it means to be the people of God. And today, when we think about applying it and using it today, instead of asking, well, what does this look like? What modern day phenomena match up with the book of Revelation? We need to remember Revelation would have been understood by the first century readers. Any interpretation that John and his readers could never have grasped or understand is probably wrong to begin with. But instead, perhaps we need to ask questions such as, how does this book inspire us to worship God? How does it inspire us to follow Jesus Christ in obedience, no matter what the consequences? My favorite verse, I think, in Revelation that summarizes the book is found in chapter 14, where the people of God are described as those who follow the Lamb no matter where he goes. And that's basically what Revelation is about. It gets us as God's people to worship the Lamb, to obey him, to follow Jesus Christ no matter where he goes, which is in Revelation usually the way of suffering and usually the way of sacrifice.